Thank you for tuning in to Lend Me Your Ear. And today's book we will be listening to Americas, The Explorer's Heaven, Chapter 1. America unknown to the ancients. The sea, which takes various names from the countries it washes and encircles the dry land, forming numerous winding bays, creeks, and meandering inlets, seems nowhere as confined and restricted within such a narrow channel as the Straits of Magellan. From there, it quickly expands again, spreading itself into two immense and almost boundless oceans. The one that opens to the north provides boundaries for the four regions of the Earth, while the one to the south is limited to Asia and America. In reality, these two oceans are essentially one continuous body of water, encircling the entire globe. This watery part of the world, which has remained largely unexplored throughout most of history, has recently been traversed by several skilled and courageous captains who, through their skill and industry, have made significant discoveries from east to west, wherever the sun rises or sets. The northern boundaries under the Arctic zone have been so obstructed by ice until now that the attempts of those who ventured to find a passage to India, either through the northeast or northwest, have been entirely futile. Regarding the southern boundaries, little effort has been made in exploration. So much of it remains unknown. However, it has been determined through experience that the waters of the Antarctic require less depth to measure than those of the Arctic Ocean. The ancient Greeks, Phoenicians, Romans, and all those who gained renown in maritime affairs during antiquity were not only ignorant but also timid. They cannot be compared even in the slightest degree to our more recent voyagers. Of old, according to an unbreakable law established by custom, as noted by Pliny, Vegetius, and others, the sea was closed off from the 11th of October until the 10th of March, and no ships dared to venture forth during this time, due to the fear of short nights and harsh weather. Even in summer, they rarely ventured out unless driven by storms or forced to navigate the open sea. Nevertheless, there is no doubt that in ancient times, many nations devoted their time and effort to the practical art of navigation, constantly engaging in seafaring activities. Sacred scriptures testify to the fact that the kings of Judea, such as Solomon, Jehoshaphat, Uzziah, and others, prepared fleets that sailed through distant seas, laden with gold from Ophir and other valuable treasures, which were imported to enrich and supply the Holy Land. Strabo also tells us that King Solomon, who lived during the same period as Homer, discovered India. Pliny relates that during the reign of Augustus, the Romans sailed through the Strait of Gibraltar and disregarded the Ne Plus Ultra warning, coasting along Spain, France, and Belgium. They not only reached the promontory of the Cimbrians, now known as Cape Schengen, Rif, but also ventured into the Northern Ocean, which bathes Norway and Lapland. Long before this, as Athenaeus recounts, Phileas Taraminites, a Greek captain, and several others sailed beyond the Pillars of Hercules, penetrating the northern seas as far as Britain and, in their daring adventure, made the first discovery of Thule. To the south, the African coasts beyond Gibraltar and Atlas were occasionally explored by several skilled captains. However, the voyage of Hanno, a Carthaginian, is particularly noteworthy. He surpassed all others and explored the coasts of Africa, as far as the Gorgades. Eudoxus of Cyzicus, fleeing from King Lathyrus, sailed from the Arabian Gulf and, passing the Cape of Good Hope, finally dropped anchor at the mouth of Gibraltar after having discovered all the eastern, southern, and western parts of Africa. Furthermore, it is worth noting that an ancient Swedish king, as Cornelius Nepos recounts, sent some Indians as a rare and grand gift to the Roman consul Metellus Sella. However, these Indians lost their way and were battered by perpetual storms and adverse weather, eventually being driven into the Northern Ocean, where they suffered shipwreck. Yet, they managed to save themselves and landed on the Swedish coast. Aristonicus Grammaticus relates that Menelaus, after the sack of Troy, became an extraordinary voyager, circling Africa and discovering India. After 8 years, he retraced his journey and returned safely to his own kingdom with great riches. This account is in line with Homer. who said in the Odyssey, Book 4,
"None must compare mansions with Jove, his seats celestial are. But with me any may, who 8 years tossed through worlds of miseries from coast to coast, mongst unknown seas, of my return small hope, Cyprus, Phoenicia, Egypt, Ethiopia, Sidon, Arabia, where their lambs are horn, their ewes teem thrice a year."
That which the Greek geographers relate about Ptolemy Euergetes, the king of Egypt, is worth remembering. They sent pilots commissioned to sound the depths and establish landmarks in the Arabian Gulf. By chance, they discovered an abandoned vessel with only one half-dead man lying among several lifeless bodies. After reviving him with appropriate remedies, they inquired about his fortune. However, he was unable to provide immediate answers, as they did not understand each other's languages. They sent him to the court where, after learning some Greek, he informed Euergetes that he was a native Indian who had been driven off course by adverse weather, eventually ending up where they found him. He also revealed that his companions had starved, having exhausted all their provisions during their wandering from their intended voyage. Kindly received, he promised the king that he could open a passage to India if he so desired. The king did not delay in taking action and immediately prepared a fleet loaded with the recommended goods. Under the guidance of this Indian pilot, they set sail for their desired port, anchoring there successfully. In return, they brought back to the king a rich cargo of silk, spices, valuable drugs, and precious gems. 60 years later, Cleopatra, determined not to miss out on the benefits gained from the previous discoveries, equipped another, larger fleet. This fleet passed through the Red Sea and discovered the stern of a ship, upon which a horse was depicted. Knowledgeable sailors deduced that it must have been a Gibraltar vessel that sailed around Africa, but tragically met with a shipwreck. This statue was later erected as a memorial in the market square of Memphis. In more recent times, the Republic of Venice was the first to venture into European trade in Africa and establish commerce with India. They sailed from Venice through the Adriatic into the Mediterranean Sea. Reaching Alexandria, they unloaded their goods and transported them overland. They then boarded ships in the Arabian Gulf and sailed directly to India. Thus, through a combination of land and sea routes, various commodities were exchanged, and the Indian-produced and valuable goods from the Orient were abundantly transported to Venice. From there, Europe enjoyed ample provisions until an Egyptian sultan allowed the route to be infested by thieves and murderous robbers. Consequently, the Venetians were forced to relocate and unload their cargo in Aleppo. They then transported their goods on mules and camels to Babylon, then to Balsarum, and finally to Ormuz, where they reshipped them directly to India. This lucrative trade and commerce thrived until the Portuguese discovered a sea route, saving the expense and effort of transporting goods such a long distance over land. Let us now delve a little deeper into the Portuguese discoveries. John, the first king of Portugal who forcefully took the African city of Ceuta from the Moors, had 5 sons. Henry, his 4th son, distinguished himself in the siege of Ceuta. After capturing the city, this prince embarked on many bold excursions in various parties against the enemy, accumulating substantial plunder daily. Growing wealthy, he equipped 2 new vessels to explore further along the African coast. However, progress was slow due to his extensive involvement in building a new city called Tarzanabala, later known as Villa Infantis. But after being admonished in a dream and reprimanded for abandoning his initial navigation plans, he set forth his intended ships in 1410. He expedited the process upon learning from some of his prisoners. It is said that Africa extends very far southward from the base of Mount Atlas. This mountain was the boundary of navigation in that direction because there was a long ridge or sandbank that extended into the shallow waters of the ocean, preventing anyone from daring to sail into the unknown out of sight of land to round this hidden cape. The first to attempt to find deep water and circumnavigate, discovering several unknown coasts and uninhabited islands belonging to that region, were Joannes Gonçalves, Tristan Varcios, and Aegidius Anies. Among them were Madeira and St. George de Picho. Where Prince Henry first settled with the Portuguese, and later with the Dutch. He also obtained a grant from Pope Martin V, declaring all the discovered territories eastward from the Canaries to be the rightful possession of the Crown of Portugal. After Henry's death in 1460, navigation and exploration of new countries were neglected. King Alfonso, who was embroiled in a civil war for his crown, had no leisure to pursue uncertain maritime endeavors. However, once he subdued his enemies, he sent out some ships that sailed as far as the river Zeniga and anchored before the city of Jenny, which became famous for trade. This city gave its name to the region and coasts of Guinea, where they engaged in trade, bartering for ivory, gold, and slaves. They established a fort and a strong garrison, shipping slaves back to Lisbon. John II succeeded his father, Alfonso, and had grand ambitions for Arabia and India. He aspired to find a passage from the Atlantic to the eastern seas. The main difficulty lay in sailing so far from land and venturing into the vast ocean, obstructed by dangerous shoals. At that time, 3 renowned mathematicians flourished: Roderick, Joseph, and Martin Behemus, who were pupils trained by Joannes Monteregius. The king consulted with them, persuading them to invent an instrument that could help sailors determine their position and latitude when the pole was not visible. They collaborated and, through their diligent study, invented the astrolabe, which proved to be immensely useful to seafarers. With this newfound aid, sailors were encouraged to venture more frequently into distant and unknown seas. Following this, King John of Portugal sent Jacques Cano with a fleet. While sailing, Cano discovered the Zare River, where he erected a pillar with a Latin and Portuguese inscription indicating the discovery of these African coasts and the reigning king at the time. He also encountered some more civilized natives who informed him of a mighty king ruling over them, whose court was located a few days' journey inland. Cano sent his representatives to this king and took 4 Africans as pledges, who willingly accompanied him to Portugal. Cano promised to return them within 15 months. Before that time elapsed, the Africans learned some of the Portuguese language and informed them that their native land was called Congo. As agreed, Cano returned them and exchanged them for the Portuguese hostages. With valuable gifts, Cano presented himself before their king, who sat on an ivory throne, with his upper body naked, his lower body covered with long silk skirts, and wearing a golden armlet on his left arm. Across his shoulders hung a horse's tail, their symbol of royal dignity. Cano humbly placed the presents at the king's feet, including a gilded flag or pennon with a cross, which Pope Innocent VI had consecrated with great ceremony. Afterward, many people from that nation converted to Christianity, and the king himself was baptized. However, Christianity gradually lost ground and fell out of favor due to the influence of its diabolical priests and others. Meanwhile, King John, i.e., he vigorously pursued the exploration, sending Jews and Christians by land from Alexandria and other parts of Egypt to India, and from there to explore the coasts on the eastern side of Africa up to the Cape of Good Hope. The goal was to find a suitable route for navigators to trade with the eastern parts of the world after rounding that point. After the death of this king, the exploration efforts remained dormant for a while. However, King Emmanuel, his successor, took up the task once again, and he sent Vasquez Gama with 4 ships. Despite numerous dangers and difficulties, Gama eventually anchored before Calicut and became the first European to find a route to the East Indies. However, 5 years prior to Gama's expedition to the east, Christopher Columbus had been engaged in Western discoveries, which turned out to be highly successful, as he discovered nothing less than a whole new world. This new continent was later named America after Americus Vespucci. Thus, the ancient division of the world, which had long been misunderstood, was now clearly demonstrated and indisputably proven through experience. Previously, the world was known by only 3 names: Asia, Africa, and Europe. But now, it was revealed that these 3 continents constituted only a part of the entire globe, as there was a second part in the south, known only by its coastlines, and a third part, the New World, which is our America. At this point, it would be appropriate to examine and explore whether the ancient civilizations had any knowledge of Africa beyond its coasts and whether they were aware of America. Regarding the former, modern scholars argue among themselves, with some ascribing great honor to antiquity, suggesting that the ancient people had made similar discoveries, or at least had some knowledge of the New World. They base this bold assertion on the authority of ancient Greek and Latin authors. One particularly influential source is the learned philosopher Plato, who describes in detail a new Atlantis located beyond the Strait of Gibraltar. This land's coast is surrounded by two vast seas dotted with scattered islands. These seas are interpreted as the Atlantic and the Southern Sea, and the islands are seen as representing Cuba, Hispaniola, Jamaica, California, and others that are scattered along the coasts of America. However, it cannot be proven that Plato was describing anything other than a figment of his imagination, an ideal land that never actually existed, even though he portrays it with great precision and apparent knowledge. Similarly, Diodorus Siculus attempts to prove that America was known to the ancients. He tells a story of how the Phoenicians were driven by a storm from the coasts of Africa westward. They eventually landed on a great and entirely unknown island, which our recent commentators identify as America. Must it be so? Certainly not, for it is merely a story without any proof or the slightest testimony. They attempt to use Aristotle to support their claim that he had knowledge of this new world, which they extract with great effort from these words.
Beyond the Herculean pillars, certain Carthaginian merchants penetrated the Atlantic Ocean so far that they eventually discovered a vast yet uninhabited island, producing nothing but grass, plants, and wild beasts, intersected by many winding rivers teeming with various kinds of fish. Was several days' sail from the mainland. Upon landing, they found the soil so fertile and the climate so temperate that they settled there and became the first settlers on the island. However, upon learning of this, the Carthaginians prohibited anyone from going there under penalty of death. Feared that if the place was praised too much, people would flock there, abandoning their own land and weakening their growing commonwealth.
But how could the Carthaginians find America without the use of the compass? Why were they so captivated by the fertility of this newfound land when the neighboring lands and fields around Carthage are flourishing and abundant? It is more likely that what Aristotle discovered long ago might be the Canary Islands or Great Britain, rather than America. The Greeks also had some knowledge of the British Isles at that time. They also try to convince you that Virgil, the great Latin poet, knew about the New World in these verses from the Aeneid, Book 6.
There is the prince promised to us before, divine Augustus Caesar, who once more shall bring golden days to the Ausonian land, kingdoms that old Saturn once commanded, and his power shall extend to India, beyond the annual circle, and beyond the annual circle, and beyond the annual sun's long journey, where great Atlas bears the burden of golden stars, the glittering spheres. Hic vir hix est, tibiquem promittis aepius ordis, Augustus Caesar divum genus, aurea conde saecula, qui rursius latio, regnata per ava Saturno quandam, super et Garamantus et Indus proferet imperium. Jacet extra sidera tellus extra anni, solisque vias, ubi coelifer atlas axem humero torque stellis ardentibus aptum.
But what does all of this prove? Can we find any mention of America or even a description of it in these writings? Although we cannot deny that the ancient sages and wise philosophers of old could easily deduce, and no doubt did deduce, that the earth and sea form the perfect shape of a globe based on the round shadow the earth casts on the moon during eclipses, the different rising and setting of the celestial luminaries, and the constant variation of the pole. Thus, with the earth and sea forming a single sphere, they could reasonably infer that the southern side of the equator could be inhabited just like the northern side. However, all these conclusions were based more on natural reason and sound judgment than on any first-hand experience or certain knowledge, which has been obtained only in recent times. Therefore, setting aside these conjectures, no one has been more grossly mistaken and completely erroneous on this matter than some of the ancients, especially the fathers of the Church. Lactantius Firmianus and St. Augustine ridiculed and dismissed as absurd the foolish opinion of the Antipodes, another habitable world beyond the equator. Lactantius, in a jesting manner, says,
"What? Indeed, here is a fine opinion introduced. Antipodes. O my people whose feet tread with ours, walking foot to foot, their heads downward, and yet they do not fall into the sky. There very likely the trees laden with fruit grow downward, and it rains, hails, and snows upward. The roofs and spires of cities, the tops of mountains, point at the sky beneath them, and the rivers are reversed, ready to flow into the air out of their channels."
But these seemingly witty observations of Lactantius, although they may serve as a joke, are not based on any serious reasons. The earth and sea, being globular and forming one universal ball, all materials belonging to this great body naturally sink towards its center. So wherever we travel, our feet are downwards and our heads upwards, with the sky above and the earth beneath. There is no need to fear that the earth would crumble and fall into the clouds anywhere. However, St. Augustine reasons better, admitting that the earth and sea form a universal globe, yet it does not follow that inhabited countries should lie opposite to our northern hemisphere. In fact, it is altogether impossible, since the antipodal side to ours is nothing but sea. And even if we were to allow that there were land and water mixed as in our world, who could prove that they were populated? How could anyone reach there, traversing vast and immense seas and enduring the extreme heat of the torrid zone that no living creature could tolerate? What then becomes of sacred scripture, which unequivocally states that all men are descended from Adam and, after the flood, from Noah and his 3 sons? Therefore, the nations of the Antipodes must be of a different origin, since there is no possibility, as they supposed, of passing from this world to that. However, since the discovery of the East and West Indies, experience, the best teacher, has taught us that in the south there are mighty lands and vast territories. As far as they have been explored, they have been found to be inhabited, extending their dominions from east to west. Although St. Augustine denied this now well-known truth long before his time, Cicero, Pliny, and others among the Greeks and Romans divided the earth into 5 zones, as described by Virgil.
The heavens enclose 5 zones, one always red with the shining sun and torrid heat. On each side lie the extreme zones, wrapped in storms and bound by cruel ice. Between cold and heat, 2 more zones, assigned by the immortal gods as dwelling places for poor mortals. The way passes through both, obliquely where the order of constellations turns.
Virgil, Pliny, and the Prince of Latin orators agree in saying that those who inhabit the earth dwell in countries so separated from one another that it is impossible for them to have any intercourse. Some of them are our Antipodes, walking with their heads downward, some with their feet against our sides, and others, like us, with their heads upright. You see how the same earth appears to be wrapped in rolls, 2 of which, separated by the other 3, are at the utmost distance from each other, lying equidistant under the vertical points of heaven, always covered with snow and ice. But the middlemost and largest one is scorched by the violent heats of the sun. 2 tracts are habitable, one to the south, our Antipodes, and the other to the north, which we inhabit. And Pliny also affirms, though against the vulgar opinion, this truth: that the earth is round about inhabited, and that people walk foot to foot in most parts thereof, though everyone is ready to ask why our Antipodes do not fall into the sky. This is a question our Antipodes may also ask concerning us. But although the ancients understood well from these and similar demonstrations that there was a habitable world towards the south under our horizon, they could not make out or believe that there was any possibility to pass there. And according to St. Augustine's conception, the earth produced nothing under either pole due to excessive cold, and the equinoxes or middle zone could not be penetrated due to the insufferable heat. Macrobius says that the equinoctial circle, the Arctic and Antarctic lines, bind the 2 habitable zones, and make them temperate by the excessive neighboring heats and colds, and these countries only give animation and comfortable enjoyment to all living creatures. Moreover, St. Augustine in some places seems to clear his own doubts, saying that people, if they could find a means to sail those vast and undiscovered seas, might make land, raising new stars under another sky. A learned father, searching for the origin of all sorts of beasts that multiply by generation, concludes that they must derive themselves from those that were saved with Noah in the ark. But how did they come to the islands? To those adjacent to and near the mainland, they might easily swim. To the remoter ones, they were transported. But this doubt is not altogether cleared, for domestic and other creatures fit for human use and sustenance were thus brought there. Yet how is it that voracious and wild creatures are also found there, such as wolves, tigers, lions, and other beasts of prey? This puzzle put St. Augustine at a standstill, and he had no other means to get off than by saying that, by God's commands or permission, the angels conveyed them there. If so, why might not God please plant men there in like manner, especially since the earth was created for human use? But what was the need for this when men can transport themselves in ships, either of their own accord for curious inquiry to find new countries, or else forced by the stress of weather to far remoter and altogether unknown lands? Besides, though the earth is divided by large bays and vast seas, in other places it is all continuous land, or at least separated by some narrow inlet or sea. So there was no difficulty for a crowded plantation to migrate and settle in another country that was not inhabited until then. Therefore, none need question that those in our other world were extracted from Adam, or, closer in time, from Noah's 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, just like us, who inhabit this world. But one question is to be observed. How, after the expiration of so many ages in these later times, was a new world discovered, altogether unknown to the ancients, when they, with their greatness of intellect and undertaking, prowess, and prudence, were in no way inferior to the moderns and were fit for great designs and grand exploits? We need not doubt or have any hesitation that the sea has been navigated in ancient times, but the first attempts were made by inexperienced sailors in pitiful and ill-contrived vessels. The heathens ascribed the art of navigation first to the Cretans, who, under the guidance of Neptune, set forth a navy to explore foreign countries. But Pliny, long before, the invention of this art was attributed to Erythra, king of Egypt, who, on pieces of timber joined and braced together, crept along the shores and ventured to discover the isles in the Red Sea. But others gave that honor to the Trojans and Mysians when they invaded Thrace with a fleet by sea. Others attribute it to the Britons, who made small vessels of leather and were the first to float on the waters with this invention. Some argue that the Samothracians were the first, while others claim that Danaus found a way by sea from Egypt to Greece before everyone else. But without any contradiction, Noah's Ark was the pattern or sample that succeeding ages built their ships by, and it is more probable because his offspring multiplied so fast that they were forced to enlarge their colonies by crossing seas and other broad rivers to settle their surplus population. There, Jason invented a ship called Argos, which was taken as a pattern by Sesostris, king of Egypt. The Erythrians made the Byreme, a galley with double banks of oars, while Amocles, a Corinthian, made one with triple banks. The Carthaginians boast of quadruple banks. Nesichthon of Quinqueremes and Alexander the Great brought them to 12 banks. Ptolemy Soter increased it to 15. Demetrius, son of Antigonus, doubled it to 30, Ptolemy Philadelphus to 40, and finally, Philopator raised them to 50 banks of oars. Hippus from Tyre was the first to set ships upon the stocks. The Rhodians invented the ketch, and the Batavians made a boat. The Copts invented the first oar, Daedalus the mast and bowsprit, Piscus the beak, the Tyrrhenians the anchor, and Typhes the rudder, taking an example from the motion of a kite's stern. Icarus found sails, which were fancied by the poets as wings, though some attribute that honor to his father, Daedalus. Minos was the first to engage in a sea fight. from which we can easily deduce that in ancient times no one ventured far into the ocean or to remote countries, not daring to trust their lightly constructed vessels. But in these later times, the art of navigation has been remarkably and rapidly improved. Yet initially, they were not bold enough to venture out of sight. The Tyrians were the first to understand how to steer their course by the North Star, and when dark and foul weather obscured the sky, preventing them from seeing heaven or earth, they directed their course by the wind. If they were unsure about its change, they released some birds to fly, whom they followed, assuming that the birds would fly directly to the nearest land. But these are poor aids and blind guides to show you land in the middle of the boundless ocean. It is certain that during the time of Julius Caesar and Augustus, the Romans expanded the boundaries of their empire eastward to the Euphrates, the Rhine, and the Danube, and westward to the ocean and Mount Atlas. They sailed up and down the Mediterranean with great fleets, enduring the violence of waves and weather. However, all of this did not make them daring enough to think about or explore new worlds. But after the decline of Roman power due to various invasions by the Goths, Vandals, Huns, Normans, Lombards, and other northern countries, which were teeming with people and overwhelmed all places like a flood, Europe was puzzled and embroiled everywhere. Their entire focus was on joining forces to resist such bold invaders, and they were preoccupied with dealing with such a vexing enemy. In the farther east, Asia was in a similar state, constantly trembling at the daily alarms and incursions of the Scythians, Persians, and Saracens. Later, the Turks grew more powerful than any of the previous invaders, and a tragic catastrophe was expected. Therefore, the known world had too much on its plate. They had their work cut out for them by these distractions and alterations of government, so it is uncertain where they would go in search of uncertainties to find something they do not know. St. Jerome adds, quoting an ancient writer,
"Great care has been taken in computing the age of this world, and if there is another world that did not commence with ours, as Clement mentions in his epistles, where are the seas and lands that make up that second world? Is it a part of the world in which Adam was created, or could it metaphorically refer to worldly affairs governed by the prince of the air, ruling in the hearts of the children of disobedience?"
Pliny, Cicero, and Virgil, who are among the best Latin writers, agree that there may be a habitable world under our horizon, in the temperate southern zone, beyond the extreme heat and on this side of the Antarctic cold. But what does all this mean for the discovery of America, which is not only under the scorching heat of the equator, but also under the frosts and snows of the Arctic and Antarctic poles? Even less probable is the interpretation of Lodowick Leo, an Augustine friar who takes a passage from Obadiah to imply that the Spaniards would not only discover and conquer America, but also convert its inhabitants to the Christian faith. This interpretation suggests that those in Sepharad would inherit and possess the cities of the south, and saviors would arise from the mountains of Zion to judge the mountain wealth of Esau. However, Obadiah's prophecy likely referred to the restoration of the Jews from the captivity of Babylon, where they would grow more powerful than ever. Led by their Messiah, they would achieve the height of felicity and send their evangelists and apostles to proclaim salvation to the farthest corners of the earth. It is true that the rabbis interpret Sepharad as Spain, and therefore they conclude that Obadiah prophesied about the Spaniards and their conquests in America, using this to argue that America was known long before Christ. Finally, the claims of Pineda and Levinus Lemnius that Solomon, upon discovering the use of the compass, rigged a navy at Ezion, Geber, to sail from the Red Sea to the Strait of Magellan and load his vessels with gold from Peru, hold little significance. It will be evident in their description that Peru is not Ophir, as some baselessly believe. Regarding King Solomon's discovery of the use of the magnet, it is easily said, but not easily proven. Although Solomon excelled all of mankind in wisdom and learning, having knowledge of the operations and occult secrets of nature, including everything related to plants from the cedar of Lebanon to hyssop and the cedar of Lebanon to hyssop and the smallest shrub on the wall, there is no evidence that he knew the navigational use of, the lodestone. Even if he did know, there is no mention of it anywhere. If this excellent invention, the compass, had been found in Solomon's time, how did it later become completely lost? Albertus Magnus is mistaken when he attributes knowledge of the compass to Aristotle, as Aristotle himself does not mention it at all. Neither Galen, Alexander Aphrodisiensis, Pliny, Lucretius, nor any other Roman, Greek, Arabian, or writers from any other country give credit to Aristotle for this. Some attribute the honor to an Indian, while others claim it was a shepherd on Mount Ida whose clouted shoes, filled with hobnails, caused the iron to stick to the stones on which he stood, halting his progress. And although the ancients discovered many secrets of nature, including the properties of the lodestone, which attracts iron as its proper food, and the 3 types of magnets, some of which do not attract steel, as found by the Amides, a Greek author, and others since then. They never attained them. Knowledge that the lodestone could alleviate pain and stop the flow of blood, even though its sharp edge, piercing the skin, opened the vein. Hieronymus Cardanus, who obtained this knowledge from Laurentius Gascus, a great surgeon, experienced this on himself and others. Furthermore, they had no inkling that when the compass needle was touched by the lodestone on the north side of the equinox, it would point north, but by depressing the Arctic pole and raising the Antarctic pole, it would steadfastly face the south. They also did not dream of its various variations based on the coasts that were closest. For example, when sailing from the island del Cuervo, the needle's point varies more to the west, but when sailing towards the equinox, it varies eastward. From this, we can conclude definitively that without the use of the lodestone, first discovered by Flavius Melvius, a Neapolitan, in the year 1303, it would have been entirely impossible to reach America. Therefore, Joseph d'Acosta is mistaken in attributing the honor of discovering such a great benefit to navigation to some Muslim seamen whom Vasco da Gama encountered near Mozambique, who had sailed those seas using the lodestone. Gama's expedition took place over 100 years after Melvius, who lived in a time when mathematical learning flourished. Few ages could boast the same. During that time, in England, Richard Wallingford, Nicolas de Linna, John Halifax, Walter Britt, John Duns and John de Ligneresias, among others abroad, were contemporaries and eminent in the astronomical arts related to navigation. Undoubtedly, they were no small help to Melvius in his fortunate invention. Lastly, we will recount what has been regarded as a seeming testimony that America was known to the Europeans before the birth of our Savior, through an ancient medal of Emperor Augustus, unearthed in Peru, and sent to the Pope in Rome. This testimony can be compared to a similar hoax devised by Hermicus Cojadus in the year 1505 near Sintra, a town in Portugal. 3 marbles inscribed with ancient characters regarding a prophecy of discovering the East Indies by the Portuguese in the reign of King Emmanuel were secretly buried underground and later dug up by a pretended accident, causing great excitement among the learned, with many exhausting themselves in attempting to explain the supposed Sibylline prediction. Chapter 2. Of the original of the Americans, whence they came, when, how, and from what people planted. About the origin of the Americans, the learned dispute so much that they find nothing more difficult in history than to clarify that point. Whether the inquiry is made about the time when the Americans first settled in their current inhabited lands, or about the manner in which they arrived there, whether by ship or by land, intentionally or accidentally, driven by storms or forced by a more powerful people to relocate from their old plantations and seek for new, or if anyone should be yet more curious, asking the way that directed them out of another country to this new world, or else inquire for those people from whom the Americans derived themselves, he will find several opinions, and the learned still jangling. The first doubt is concerning the time. Mr. Purchas, wherever he had the hint, endeavors to prove that America has been but lately planted, for which he thus argues, if Asia or Europe furnished America with people in Abraham's time, or at least before the birth of our Savior, then it must, upon necessity, by the expiration of so many ages, have been much more populous than the Spaniards found when they first discovered it. Besides, the vast territories yet uninhabited, says he, are sufficient testimonies that this new world has been planted but scattered, and not many ages have passed since. Otherwise, the country would have abounded with inhabitants because the fertility of the soil was able plentifully to sustain millions more than were there when first discovered. And what marks a better to know a new people by in any country than a rude life and an unsettled government? Just like a family moving to another house, which takes no short time to settle their goods and household stuff in a handsome and convenient order. When Noah went out of the ark on Mount Ararat and not long after saw his seed spread over Armenia and Assyria, the new generation of people consisted of shepherds and husbandmen who settled themselves near lakes and rivers, villages, cities, and much less. Whole kingdoms were scarce on the face of the earth, as were trade or commerce. Riches, division of lands, costly garments, and furniture for houses were not then in use, but the works of long settlements in happy peace. To curb growing wickedness and the pride of libertines who encroached upon their weaker neighbors, laws were invented, by which bridle, the unbroke or wild world grew tamer. And first, the Assyrians were brought to endure the bit and answer the reins of government, then Egypt, next Greece, and after that the Romans, who spread their power by arms and martial discipline, first civilized the Gauls, Spain, Britain, and lastly Germany. But because a country or pastoral life, knowing no commerce but mean hovels and to dwell in huts, priding in poverty and no habits, despising all greatness unlimited by laws and all things else, which the people observed presently after the flood, is now found among the Americans, who will take them for aught else but newcomers to that land, as themselves acknowledge. For the Mexicans boast that they are the eldest there, and that from them Peru, Chile, Chica, and other countries towards the south had their colonies, and yet the oldest chronicles of Mexico reckon not above 1,000 years. But certainly, all this muster of apparent reasons is not able to vanquish a single truth. For granted that America was not very populous when the Spaniards first arrived there, must this prove that it was never well inhabited before? Perhaps the civil wars, which have always been destructive to this nation, have hindered the increase of people, and the more so because their savage nature is such that in several places they account for man's flesh broiled a very great dainty. And suppose such prodigal excess of their human banquets were not used in America, as indeed they are, is it a wonder that such a great part of the world, not only exceeding Europe in size, but also Asia, should here and there have a tract of land uninhabited? These might, by reason of their barrenness, be useless, as many such places are found in the midst of the most populous and fertile countries. But above all this, it is certain that America to this day, notwithstanding the almost innumerable thousands of Indians formerly slain and massacred by the Spaniards, is so well inhabited that it may stand in competition with either Asia or Europe. And how could such vast multitudes plant the far-spreading country of America without the help of many ages? Moreover, this truth is not without sufficient testimonies. When anyone looks at the islands with which America lies encompassed, he may suppose they did not willingly go from the main continent to the isles, but were driven thither by wars among themselves, or, as most times it happens, because of the vast increase of the natives. The country must discharge its burden. Here too is added the several languages used in America, as in Europe or any other part of the known world, whereby we may easily guess that America was populated presently after the confusion of tongues at Babel. Furthermore, if the Americans live a rude life, go meanly habitual, and be without stately houses, such customs are even among us observed by several people, such as the Tartars, Numidians, and others, which made their antiquity be called in question. He also must have no knowledge of the arts and mechanical sciences used by the Americans, who conclude that they settled in America. One argument at present will be sufficient to contradict them all, and in the further description, the contrary will be more manifest. Hieronymus Benso relates that he stood amazed at the gold and silversmiths in the territory of Cheto, who, without any iron tools, made images and all manner of vessels, which work they performed thus. First, they made an oval crucible of a good look, round about pasted with earth, embodied with the powder of wood coals, which crucible, being baked very hard in the sun, they filled with pieces of gold or silver, and put in the fire, about which, standing with 5, 6 or more pipes made of canes. They blew the fire so long until the metal melted, which others sitting on the ground ran into moulds of black stone, and so with little trouble cast into whatever shape they please. Lastly, though, Mexico can reckon only 1,000 years. Must it therefore follow that the inhabitants are no older? How many famous places, even among ourselves, no longer register, and if they have, they are commonly fabulous. Sect 1. In the next place, let us inquire, how were the Americans transmitted there? Whether by sea or land? Both are feasible in several ways. If they made an expedition either as discoverers or were driven on those coasts by the stress of weather, the first is most unlikely and not seeming possible. For how could they steer through such a vast ocean to countries they never heard of without the compass and other necessities for such a voyage? For when first discovered, their want of experience in shipping for so long a voyage, knowing no further than the use of small boats or canoes, plainly explodes that they willingly steered from a known world to an unknown, with no better accommodation, but some probable reasons may be made out to induce us to believe that they were rather driven thither by storm. But some will say, how lived the little boats, and how endured they in such a continual tempest, and were not either swallowed up amidst the waves, or starved for want of provision, which their hollow troughs could not contain. The first doubt is the least, for there are examples enough by which it appears that oftentimes great ships, bulging, are overset or sunk in the sea by foul weather, when the mariners escape in their cockboat. And if they were but thinly victualled for so long a voyage, questionless, that little which they had, they spun out and made it last while the impetuous storm shortened the passage, which fair weather would have made much longer. Pliny tells us of Annius Ploquius, general of the Red Sea, that one of his slaves being enfranchised, sailing down towards the Arabian Gulf, was carried by a violent tempest from the north, beyond Caramania, and on the 15th day came to an anchor in Hippurus, a haven of Taprobane, which Ortelius judges to be Sumatra. But Mercator and Claverius, on better grounds, say Ceylon, which is no less than 3,000 English miles. In like manner, Joseph de Acosta tells us that in 15 days' time he got a northerly wind from the Canaries to America, and his voyage had been shorter, although he had borne more sails, which may partly clear the former doubts. Moreover, the Peruvians themselves give some small testimony, in their ancient records, of a few that landed of old upon their coasts, which were, as they say, mighty and cruel giants, committing much bloodshed, slaughtering the natives everywhere, and having subdued the whole country, built stately edifices, of which some remain but the ruins of some foundations, very artificial and costly. They also show near Manta and Puerto Viejo many huge bones, as they believe of giants 3 times longer and thicker than an ordinary man's. They also tell us that many ages ago Ica and Arica sailed westward thither upon sea wolves' skins, blown up like bladders. But, however, without contradiction, the Americans never knew, much less built, any such vessels with which they would venture to the open ocean out of sight of land. Their balsas, periagos, and canoes will not all amount to the bulk of one of our small barques. Therefore, the inhabitants of Tumbes, when they described the Spanish fleet sent to discover Peru, were amazed at the high masts, spreading sails, and bigness of the ships, judging them first to be rocks cast up out of the sea, but observing them approaching their coast and seeing that they were full of bearded men, they thought the gods were walking in them. Our modern poet, Mr. Dryden, in his Indian Emperor, thus elegantly described, Guiomar to Montezuma.
I went in order, sir, to your command, to view the utmost limits of the land, to see that shore where no more world is found, but foamy billows breaking on the ground, where, For a while, my eyes no object met, but distant skies, that in the ocean set, and low-hung clouds, that adapt themselves in rain, to shake their fleeces on the earth again. At last, as far as I could cast my eyes upon the sea, somewhat, methought did rise like bluish mists, which still appearing more, took dreadful shapes, and moved towards the shore. Montezuma, what forms did these new wonders represent? More strange than what your wonder can invent. The object I could first distinctly view was tall straight trees, which on the waters flew, wings on their sides, instead of leaves did grow, which gathered all the breath the winds could blow, and at their roots grew floating palaces, whose blown bellies cut the yielding seas. Montezuma, what divine monsters, O ye gods, were these that float in air and fly upon the seas? Came they alive or dead upon the shore? Guiomar. Alas, they lived too sure, I heard them roar. All turned their sides and to each other spoke. I saw their words break out in fire and smoke. Sure, 'tis their voice that thunders from on high, or these, the younger brothers of the sky. Deaf with the noise, I took my hasty flight. No mortal courage can support the fright.
But the resolution of these doubts starts a harder question. Namely, if the Americans were driven thither by a tempest, how then came the beasts thither? It is certain that those which are beneficial for human use, as dogs for hunting, great cattle, sheep for food, and other necessities, might easily be carried thither. For so the Spaniards brought cows, horses, swine, and other cattle, as well as poultry, from Spain to the newly discovered islands, Cuba, Hispaniola, Jamaica, Margarita, and La Dominica, where at their arrival, formerly no four-footed beasts were found, whose fertile soil has so multiplied their increase that the dogs, running wild and breeding as fast, do great harm to the grazing herds, which they only shoot for, their skins leaving their flesh, the best of meats, only to manure the ground on which they lie. The transporting of tame and profitable cattle might easily be allowed, but who would load their ships with lions, tigers, bears, wolves, foxes, and other serpents and voracious beasts? It is certain that some may be tamed before they are shipped. Lampridius relates that Heliogabalus, the Roman emperor, took great pleasure in domestic lions and leopards to frighten his guests with. For the third course, they were all brought in and sat between the invited, a man and a beast. The great Cham, as Paulus Venetus, an eyewitness, attests, rides on hunting, attended in couples with tame leopards. The king of Cambodia, in a similar manner, is served with panthers. Scaliger adds also that they went not unprovided of a lamb or goat to give the panther, lest, falling into his natural ferocity, provoked by hunger, he should make the huntsman his quarry if he had no other prey. But notwithstanding, some wild beasts seem to forget their voracious nature, yet great care ought to be taken in the transporting of them, because they oftentimes grow wild again, which France can witness where two leopards, a male and a female, being tamed presently after the death of King Francis, whether negligently or on purpose, let loose, ran into the woods, and near Orleans devoured a great number of people and cattle. Gessner says that some women's bodies were found untouched, only their breasts eaten by the leopards, as if they took them for the daintiest part, which is not unlike the ancient Gires, who according to St. Hierome entertained their guests with a most delicious dish with women's breasts and men's, buttocks, roasted. Besides the devouring nature of these wild beasts, what profit could tigers, lions, wolves, bears, and the like bring to the transporter? And how came serpents, adders, and other reptiles thither over the ocean that, with no art whatsoever, can be made tame? Were the small vessels just laden with such terrible creatures when, against their wills, they were by storm driven on a new coast? By these impossibilities, we may easily judge that the Americans came thither by land and no other way, but how and upon what occasion must be our next inquiry. This concludes Part 1, Americas, The Explorer's Heaven. Please stay tuned for Part 2. So thank you very much, and you have been tuned in to Lend Me Your Ear.